An unexpected incident at 30,000 feet. The airport hummed with energy as travelers from all corners of the globe bustled through the terminal, their destinations as varied as their expressions. Among them was Daniel Carter, a man in his late 40s with sharp features and an air of quiet authority. He wore a simple navy blazer and jeans, his casual yet confident demeanor setting him apart from the frenetic crowd. Tucked under his arm was a black leather bag, and perched on his head was a red baseball cap emblazoned with bold white letters. "Make America Great Again." Daniel was no stranger to the reaction his hat often provoked. While he viewed it as a representation of personal ideals and resilience, others often saw it as a lightning rod for controversy. Today, as he walked toward the boarding gate for his flight to San Francisco, he noticed the usual glances. Some passengers avoided eye contact. Others whispered behind cupped hands. A few even took quick photos with their phones, their faces a mix of curiosity and disdain. He sighed inwardly, adjusting the brim of the hat. The attention wasn't new, but it still made him long for a time when people saw beyond appearances. As Daniel approached the first-class boarding line, he handed his ticket to the gate agent, a young woman with a polished smile. She scanned his boarding pass without comment, her eyes briefly flicking to his hat before returning to her task. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone neutral. Daniel nodded and made his way onto the plane. Settling into his seat, he pulled out a book and tried to ignore the uneasy glances from a few fellow passengers. Half an hour later, as the plane taxied down the runway and ascended into the clouds, Daniel became immersed in his reading. The faint hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glasses in the galley provided a soothing backdrop. But peace on the flight was short-lived. A flight attendant named Karen Bishop, a woman in her early 30s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a no-nonsense expression, approached Daniel's row. She paused, her eyes narrowing as they landed on his hat. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice firm but polite. "Would you mind removing your hat? It's causing some discomfort among other passengers." Daniel looked up from his book, his brow furrowing. "My hat. Is there a specific policy against wearing it?" Karen hesitated, her professional demeanor flickering slightly. "No, sir, but we strive to create a comfortable environment for all passengers, and some have expressed concerns." Daniel set his book aside and leaned back, his voice calm. "I understand your intent, but I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just sitting here, minding my business. Surely we can all coexist without turning clothing into a problem." Karen's lips thinned, and she straightened. "I'll ask you again to remove the hat, sir. If not, I'll need to escalate this matter." Daniel stared at her, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're welcome to do that." Karen walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the carpeted floor. Moments later, she returned with another flight attendant and a member of the crew, their expressions a mix of unease and determination. "Sir," the crew member began, "I must insist that you comply with the flight attendant's request. If you refuse, we may have to take further action, including removing you from the flight." Passengers nearby began whispering, their phones discreetly capturing the unfolding drama. Daniel glanced around, sensing the growing tension. He removed his hat slowly, placing it on his lap. "There," he said evenly. "Problem solved." But it wasn't enough. Karen's gaze hardened. "We'll still need to speak with you privately upon landing. Your presence is disruptive." Disruptive. Daniel's tone carried a sharp edge now, though he remained composed. "All I've done is sit here and read a book. If that's disruptive, perhaps the problem isn't me." The murmurs among passengers grew louder, a mix of indignation and support. One woman muttered, "It's just a hat," while another snapped, "He should have known better." Daniel said no more. He replaced his hat on his head and returned to his book, ignoring the weight of the stares directed his way. As the plane landed in San Francisco, Daniel was escorted off by airport security, leaving behind a cabin filled with stunned passengers and buzzing conversations. He followed the officers to a small conference room in the terminal, where he was asked to wait. The air in the room was cool, the atmosphere tense. Daniel leaned back in the chair, his calm exterior betraying none of the irritation simmering beneath the surface. Minutes later, Karen entered the room, accompanied by a uniformed airport official. She stood with her arms crossed, her expression smug. "Mr. Carter," the official began, his tone apologetic yet firm. "We've reviewed the situation. While you haven't violated any formal policies, the airline reserves the right to refuse service if a passenger is deemed a disruption." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his piercing gaze landing on Karen. A disruption based on what? A hat that made someone uncomfortable, or the assumption that wearing it means I'm a certain kind of person? Karen shifted uneasily but said nothing. The official cleared his throat. "We're offering to book you on a later flight, at no additional charge." Daniel smiled faintly, his tone laced with quiet authority. "Don't bother. I'll handle it myself." He stood, gathered his belongings, and turned to Karen. "You might want to reconsider how you define disruption. It says more about you than it does about me." With that, Daniel left the room, his shoulders square and his head held high. As he stepped into the bustling terminal, he reached for his phone and made a call. "It's me," he said, his voice steady. "We've got an incident. Prepare a statement, and tell the team I'll be addressing this personally." The person on the other end hesitated before replying. "Understood, Mr. Carter. What's the plan?" Daniel glanced down at the hat in his hand and smiled faintly. "The plan," he said, "is to remind them who owns this airline. The fallout begins." The drive to Daniel Carter's San Francisco office was a quiet one, interrupted only by the soft hum of the car engine. His assistant, a sharp and efficient young woman named Olivia Hughes, sat beside him in the back seat, scrolling through her phone. "It's already hitting social media," Olivia said, her voice low but tense. "Videos of the incident are going viral. People are taking sides, of course. Some are calling it censorship, others are framing it as justified." Daniel stared out the window, his expression unreadable. The sprawling cityscape of San Francisco rolled by, but his mind was elsewhere. This wasn't just about an argument on a plane. It was about principle, integrity, and his ability to effect change in an industry he had spent decades quietly dominating. "And the airline?" Daniel asked, his voice calm. Olivia hesitated. "They issued a generic statement about ensuring passenger comfort and safety. No direct mention of you yet, but they're clearly trying to get ahead of the story." Daniel nodded, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "They'll have to try harder." By the time Daniel arrived at his office, his legal and PR teams were already gathered in the conference room. Screens mounted on the walls displayed a real-time feed of social media posts and news coverage. Hashtags like #Hackgate and #FreedomToffoli trended alongside debates about free expression and corporate policies. Emily Reyes, the head of PR, stood at the front of the room, gesturing to a series of headlines. "This story has legs," she said. "It's not just about you, Daniel. It's become a national conversation about individual rights versus collective comfort. News outlets are eating it up." Daniel took a seat at the head of the table, his presence commanding silence. "What's our response strategy?" Emily exchanged a glance with Darren Monroe, the company's lead legal counsel, before replying. "We have two options. One, we downplay your involvement and let the airline handle this as a standard passenger complaint. Two, we make this personal and position you as a leader in addressing broader issues." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "There's no question. We're taking option two." Darren cleared his throat. "If we go that route, we'll need to address the airline's policies directly. As the majority shareholder, you have the authority to demand changes, but it could get messy." "Good," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Change is messy. Let's not shy away from it." Olivia, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "There's another angle to consider. The flight attendant, Karen Bishop, she's becoming a focal point of the backlash. People are digging into her history, speculating about her motivations. If we're not careful, this could spiral into a personal attack against her. Daniel frowned. That's not what I want. This isn't about vilifying individuals. It's about addressing systemic issues. Make sure the message stays focused. Emily nodded. Understood. We'll craft a statement emphasizing leadership and constructive dialogue. But you should know, this will put you directly in the spotlight. Are you prepared for that? Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. I've spent most of my career behind the scenes. Maybe it's time for a change. Across town, Karen Bishop sat in her modest apartment, staring at her phone in growing horror. The initial wave of messages had been bad enough. Angry comments accusing her of overreach and bias. But now her personal information was circulating online. Strangers had found her social media accounts, her address, even photos of her family. The messages had turned darker, threatening. Her roommate, Mia, sat across the room, scrolling through her own phone. This is getting out of hand, Maya said. You need to call the airline. Tell them to issue a statement defending you. Karen shook her head, her hands trembling. They won't. They're already distancing themselves from me. I'm just a scapegoat now. Mia frowned. Then why don't you tell your side of the story? Set the record straight. Karen hesitated. She had always prided herself on professionalism, but now her actions were being dissected by millions of strangers. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said softly. I thought I was protecting other passengers. Mia's expression softened. Maybe you were, but you need to ask yourself, were you really protecting them, or just reacting to your own biases? Karen stared at the floor, her chest tightening. She had never thought of herself as biased, but the question lingered uncomfortably close to the truth. The next day, Daniel stood before a crowd of reporters at a press conference held at one of his company's properties in downtown San Francisco. The room buzzed with anticipation, cameras trained on the podium. Dressed in a crisp suit, Daniel exuded confidence as he stepped up to the microphone. He began without preamble. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. By now, many of you are aware of the incident that occurred on my flight to San Francisco. Let me start by saying this. This isn't about a hat, and it isn't about me. This is about something much bigger. He paused, letting his words sink in. This incident has sparked a conversation about how we treat one another, particularly in environments where tensions can run high. It's about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the policies we enforce. As someone with a significant stake in this airline, I take responsibility for addressing these issues head-on. The room erupted in murmurs as reporters scribbled notes and whispered among themselves. To that end, Daniel continued, I am announcing a comprehensive review of the airline's policies, including training programs to address unconscious bias, conflict resolution, and inclusivity. These changes will not only apply to frontline staff, but to every level of the organization, including leadership. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Carter, some are calling this a publicity stunt. How do you respond to that? Daniel smiled faintly. If standing up for what's right is a stunt, then I'm guilty as charged. But let me be clear, this isn't about optics. It's about creating lasting change. Another reporter jumped in. What about the flight attendant involved in the incident? Do you hold her personally responsible? Daniel's expression grew serious. This isn't about blaming individuals. It's about recognizing that we all have blind spots and creating systems that address them. I hope the flight attendant, like everyone else in this organization, can learn and grow from this experience. Later that evening, Daniel's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He answered, his tone cautious. This is Daniel Carter. There was a pause before a familiar voice spoke. Mr. Carter, this is Karen Bishop. Daniel's brow furrowed. Ms. Bishop, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I wanted to apologize, Karen said, her voice shaky but sincere. Not just for what happened on the flight, but for the assumptions I made. I realize now that I let my own discomfort dictate my actions, and that wasn't fair to you or anyone else. Daniel listened silently, giving her space to speak. I don't expect forgiveness, she continued, but I want to make things right. If there's any way I can contribute to the changes you're making, I'd like to help. Daniel's tone softened. Acknowledging our mistakes is never easy, Ms. Bishop. It's a start. Let's meet and discuss how you can be part of the solution. Karen exhaled, relief evident in her voice. Thank you. I won't let you down. As he ended the call, Daniel leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. Perhaps this incident, chaotic as it was, could lead to something greater than either of them had imagined. The fallout was far from over, but the foundation for change had been laid. Unmasking the system. The following week, Daniel Carter's schedule was packed with meetings, press appearances, and policy workshops. Yet amidst the chaos, one event stood out: a private meeting with Karen Bishop. He had agreed to hear her out, not out of charity, but because he believed in second chances. If Karen was willing to face her own shortcomings and work for change, she could become a powerful symbol of transformation. Karen arrived at Skyline Holdings' San Francisco office early, clutching the slim portfolio of notes. She had spent days agonizing over this meeting, torn between anxiety and determination. Her reflection in the elevator doors revealed the toll the past week had taken. Shadows under her eyes, a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. Yet her gaze was steady, a glimmer of resolve shining through. The receptionist guided her to a sleek conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Daniel was already there, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. His presence was as commanding as ever, but when he turned to greet her, his expression was warm. "Ms. Bishop," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Karen shook his hand, her grip firm despite her nerves. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Mr. Carter." Daniel gestured for her to sit. "Let's drop the formalities. Call me Daniel. This isn't a tribunal, it's a conversation." Karen managed a small smile and took a seat across from him. "Then call me Karen." Daniel nodded. "All right, Karen. Let's start with the obvious. Why are you here?" She exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. "I'm here because I made a mistake. I let my personal biases cloud my judgment, and I failed to treat you, and probably others, with the fairness and respect they deserve. I spent the past week reflecting on that, and I realize now that I can't just apologize and move on. I want to be part of the solution." Daniel leaned forward, studying her intently. "What does being part of the solution look like to you?" Karen hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of her portfolio. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know it starts with listening to perspectives I've ignored or dismissed in the past, and I know I need to educate myself about the biases I didn't even realize I had." Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Acknowledging what you don't know is the first step. Now let's talk about what you can contribute." Over the next hour, Daniel outlined his vision for the airline's transformation. He spoke of mandatory training programs, employee-led diversity councils, and community outreach initiatives designed to rebuild trust with underrepresented groups. Karen listened intently, her initial nervousness giving way to a growing sense of purpose. "There's one more thing," Daniel said, his tone shifting. "I want you to share your story." Karen blinked. "My story? You mean what happened on the flight?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "But not just that. I want you to talk about what you've learned since then, about biases, about growth, and about accountability. Your journey could inspire others to confront their own blind spots." Karen's stomach knotted. The idea of speaking publicly about her mistakes was terrifying, yet she couldn't deny the potential impact. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. "If it helps even one person see things differently, it'll be worth it." Daniel nodded, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. "Good. You'll have my full support." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Skyline Holdings was working tirelessly to overhaul the airline's policies. Emily Reyes and her PR team coordinated with external consultants to design training modules on unconscious bias and cultural competency. Darren Monroe navigated the legal complexities of implementing these changes across a sprawling multinational organization. At the heart of these efforts was Daniel, who insisted on transparency at every step. "This isn't just about fixing one incident," he told his team during a strategy meeting. "It's about setting a new standard for the entire industry." The changes didn't come without resistance. A faction within the airline's board of directors argued that the reforms were too drastic, too costly. Some employees bristled at the idea of mandatory training, viewing it as an unnecessary imposition. Daniel faced these challenges head-on. At a tense board meeting, he addressed the dissenting members directly. "I understand your concerns," he said, his tone measured but firm. "But let me ask you this: what's the cost of not making these changes? How many more incidents like this will it take before our reputation and our bottom line are irreparably damaged? This isn't just the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do." The board reluctantly conceded, and the reforms moved forward. As the new policies began to take shape, Karen found herself thrust into the spotlight. Her first public appearance was at a company-wide town hall, streamed live to employees around the world. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as Daniel introduced her to the crowd. "Today, you're going to hear from someone who's been at the center of this conversation," he said. "Karen Bishop has shown remarkable courage in facing her mistakes and committing to change. Her story is one we can all learn from." Karen stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. She glanced at the sea of faces before her, then took a deep breath. "My name is Karen Bishop," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I'm here because I got it wrong." The room fell silent as she recounted the incident on the flight, her assumptions about Daniel, and the fallout that followed. She spoke candidly about the backlash she had faced, but also about the introspection it had forced. "I've learned that biases aren't always obvious," she said. "Sometimes they're buried so deep that we don't even realize they're there, but that doesn't excuse them. It's our responsibility to uncover them, to question them, and to do better." By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet, applauding. Karen felt a surge of emotion, relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. In the weeks that followed, the airline's transformation began to take root. Employees at all levels participated in the new training programs, which emphasized empathy, active listening, and conflict resolution. The airline also launched a public awareness campaign, showcasing its commitment to inclusivity and fairness. Karen became a key figure in these efforts, speaking at industry conferences and sharing her story in interviews. Her willingness to confront her own biases resonated with people from all walks of life, sparking conversations about accountability and growth. As for Daniel, he continued to lead by example, pushing the airline and the industry to aim higher. His decision to embrace transparency had turned a potential PR disaster into a case study in ethical leadership. One evening, as Daniel reviewed a stack of reports in his office, Olivia walked in with a tablet. "You'll want to see this," she said, handing it to him. The screen displayed an article from a major news outlet. The headline read, "From Biased to Breakthrough: How an Airline's Controversy Sparked Industry-Wide Change." Daniel smiled faintly. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the right path. Resistance and reflection. As Karen Bishop's story gained traction and the airline's new policies began rolling out, not everyone embraced the changes with open arms. Inside the company, a vocal minority of employees pushed back against the mandatory training programs and the increased scrutiny on their interactions with passengers. At a packed training session in Chicago, tensions reached a boiling point. The instructor, a seasoned diversity consultant named Monica Perez, stood before a room of flight attendants, pilots, and ground crew. She projected a slide onto the screen. Understanding unconscious bias, recognizing hidden assumptions. Karen sat in the back of the room as an observer, taking notes for a report she was preparing. The atmosphere was tense, with several attendees crossing their arms or leaning back in their chairs with skeptical expressions. "This is ridiculous," muttered a man in the front row, his name tag reading Brad. He was a senior pilot with salt and pepper hair and a booming voice. "I've been flying for 20 years without anyone accusing me of bias. Now I'm being treated like a problem." Monica remained composed. "Brad, this training isn't about accusing anyone of wrongdoing. It's about helping us all recognize the assumptions we make, often without realizing it, and how those assumptions can affect others." Brad scoffed. "So now I have to tiptoe around everyone's feelings. What happened to focusing on doing our jobs?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Karen felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had anticipated resistance, but seeing it unfold in real time was more disheartening than she had imagined. Monica nodded, acknowledging the pushback. "Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a passenger who made you feel uneasy for no specific reason? Maybe it was something about how they looked or spoke." Brad hesitated, his expression tightening. "Maybe. But that's just instinct. It's part of staying alert." "Exactly," Monica said. "Instincts are shaped by our experiences and our biases. The goal here isn't to suppress your instincts, but to understand them. When you're aware of your biases, you're better equipped to make fair, objective decisions." The room fell quiet. Karen watched as some of the attendees began to shift in their seats, their expressions softening. Later, during a break, Karen approached Brad by the coffee station. He glanced at her with a mix of curiosity and irritation. "You're the one from that flight, right?" he said, his tone sharp. "The one who caused all this?" Karen met his gaze steadily. "I'm the one who made a mistake, yes, but I'm also the one trying to learn from it. Aren't you?" Brad snorted. "Easy for you to say. You're the poster child for this whole thing now. The rest of us are just trying to do our jobs." Karen took a deep breath. "I get it. Change is uncomfortable, especially when it feels like it's being forced on you. But trust me, this isn't about pointing fingers. It's about making sure we don't let our assumptions hurt people." Brad's jaw tightened. For a moment, Karen thought he was going to brush her off. But then he sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Maybe you're right," he admitted grudgingly. "But it still feels like we're being singled out." "You're not," Karen said softly. "We're all in this together. And if I can face my mistakes in front of the whole world, I think we can all handle a little self-reflection." Brad gave a reluctant nod. "Fair enough." Meanwhile, at Skyline Holdings headquarters, Daniel Carter was facing resistance of his own. Several board members had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss what they called the excessive visibility of the airline's reforms. They were concerned that the media attention, while largely positive, could alienate certain customer demographics. Margaret Hale, the airline CEO, led the charge. "Mr. Carter, while we appreciate your leadership, we must consider the long-term implications of this strategy. Not all of our customers share the same values. By taking such a public stance, we risk alienating a significant portion of our base." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Are you suggesting we cater to prejudice to preserve profits?" Margaret hesitated, her carefully composed demeanor faltering. "I'm suggesting we find a balance. We need to be inclusive without being polarizing." Daniel folded his hands on the table. "Inclusivity isn't about balance. It's about fairness and respect. If we lose customers because we stand up for those values, so be it. I'd rather have an airline with principles than one that compromises for the sake of convenience." The room fell silent. Even Margaret couldn't muster a rebuttal. One of the board members, a younger man named Greg Lawson, broke the tension. "I think Daniel's right," Greg said. "The public's response has been overwhelmingly positive. If we stay the course, we'll build loyalty that money can't buy." Daniel nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Greg, And let me remind everyone, this isn't just about optics. It's about doing what's right. For our employees, our passengers, and the industry as a whole. Despite the internal challenges, the airline's transformation began to show tangible results. Passenger satisfaction scores climbed as employees reported feeling more confident and supported in handling complex situations. Social media buzzed with stories of positive interactions, from flight attendants diffusing tense situations with empathy to ground crew going above and beyond to assist passengers with unique needs. Karen became a fixture at these events, sharing her story and helping to facilitate difficult conversations. Her journey from antagonist to advocate inspired many, but it also came with its own set of challenges. She faced criticism from both sides. Some accused her of grandstanding, while others dismissed her efforts as performative. One evening, after a particularly grueling event, Karen called Daniel. It was late, but she needed advice. "How do you deal with the criticism?" she asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "No matter what I do, it feels like it's never enough." Daniel's voice was steady on the other end of the line. "You can't please everyone, Karen. And you shouldn't try. Focus on the people who are willing to listen, to learn. They're the ones who matter." Karen sighed. I want people to see that I'm trying." "They will," Daniel assured her. "It takes time, but every step you take inspires someone else to do the same. Don't underestimate the ripple effect of your actions." As Karen hung up the phone, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't just fixing her own mistakes. She was part of something much bigger. And while the road ahead was far from easy, she knew it was one worth traveling. Across the city, Daniel gazed out the window of his office, his thoughts on the work still to come. The resistance they faced was a reminder of how deeply entrenched biases could be, but it also fueled his resolve. This wasn't just about an airline anymore. It was about creating a blueprint for change, one that could ripple far beyond the skies. The turning tide. Months had passed since the infamous incident on Daniel Carter's flight, and the airline's transformation was now in full swing. The internal pushback had begun to quiet as employees started to see the tangible benefits of the new policies. Still, the journey had been fraught with challenges, and there were moments when both Daniel and Karen wondered if the effort would ever truly pay off. One morning, Daniel sat in his penthouse office, gazing at the report Olivia had just handed him. It detailed the latest metrics on employee satisfaction, passenger feedback, and the effectiveness of the new training programs. His lips curled into a faint smile as he scanned the data. "Passenger satisfaction is up 18%, Olivia said, sitting across from him. "And employees are reporting fewer conflicts during flights. The numbers don't lie. This is working." Daniel nodded but remained cautious. "Numbers are good, but they're just part of the story. What about public perception?" Olivia tapped her tablet, pulling up a dashboard of social media analytics and news coverage. Over 75% of public sentiment about the airline is now positive. The campaign you spearheaded is still trending, and Karen's speaking engagements have generated a lot of goodwill. Daniel's eyes lingered on a chart showing spikes in positive mentions. "And the board?" "They're quieter," Olivia said with a slight smirk. "Margaret Hale is still pushing for more subtlety, but even she can't argue with the results." Across town, Karen was preparing for one of her most significant public appearances yet. She had been invited to speak at a major aviation industry summit, sharing the stage with executives from some of the world's largest airlines. The theme of the event was redefining leadership in a changing world, and Karen's story had become a centerpiece of the conversation. In the green room, Karen paced nervously, clutching a note card with her key points. Though she had spoken at numerous events by now, this one felt different. The audience included industry heavyweights who had the power to replicate or dismiss the changes Daniel and his team had fought so hard to implement. Her thoughts were interrupted when Daniel entered the room, his presence as calming as ever. "Nervous?" he asked, a small smile playing on his lips. Karen let out a shaky laugh. That obvious? Daniel nodded toward the note card in her hand. It's good to be prepared, but don't rely on that too much. Speak from the heart. That's what people connect with. She took a deep breath, nodding. Thanks, Daniel, for everything. He waved off the gratitude. You've earned this. Now go out there and remind them why change matters. The auditorium was packed when Karen stepped onto the stage. The bright lights momentarily blinded her, but the applause from the audience gave her courage. She approached the podium and adjusted the microphone, her hand steady despite her pounding heart. Good afternoon, she began, her voice clear and firm. My name is Karen Bishop, and I'm here because I made a mistake. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. A year ago, I let my personal biases affect how I treated a passenger on a flight. I thought I was upholding company policy, but in reality, I was projecting my own discomfort onto someone else. That passenger was Daniel Carter, the man who now leads this airline's transformation. She paused, scanning the audience. Some faces were skeptical, others curious, but most appeared engaged. That mistake cost me a lot, Karen continued. It cost me my confidence, my reputation, and for a time, my belief in myself. But it also gave me something invaluable, the chance to learn, to grow, and to be part of something bigger than myself. She spoke about the airline's journey, the resistance, the breakthroughs, and the moments of vulnerability that had brought them to this point. She described the training programs, the employee stories that had inspired her, and the passengers whose experiences had been transformed. This isn't just about one airline or one industry, Karen said, her voice gaining strength. It's about how we treat each other as human beings. It's about recognizing that we all carry biases, but we also have the power to overcome them. By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet, applauding. Karen felt a wave of relief and pride wash over her. For the first time, she truly believed in her own ability to make a difference. The impact of Karen's speech was immediate. Industry leaders approached her after the event, eager to learn more about the airline's initiatives. Some even expressed interest in implementing similar programs within their own organizations. Daniel watched from the sidelines, his satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that there was still much work to be done. As Karen navigated the crowd, shaking hands and answering questions, he felt a surge of pride, not just in her, but in the team that had made this transformation possible. Later that evening, Daniel and Karen met for dinner at a quiet restaurant to decompress. Over glasses of wine and plates of pasta, they reflected on the journey so far. You were incredible today, Daniel said, raising his glass in a toast. You've come a long way. Karen smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. Daniel shook his head. You earned that chance, and you've proven that change is possible when we're willing to face the uncomfortable truths. Karen hesitated, then asked, Do you ever think about how this all started? About that flight? All the time, Daniel admitted. It reminds me why we're doing this. One small moment can ripple out in ways we can't even imagine. Karen nodded, her gaze thoughtful. I just hope those ripples keep spreading. They will, Daniel said with quiet conviction. We've started something bigger than either of us. As the weeks passed, the airline's transformation continued to garner attention. News outlets hailed it as a model for corporate accountability, and passengers shared their positive experiences on social media. The changes began to ripple beyond the airline, sparking similar initiatives in other industries. For Daniel, the journey was far from over. But for the first time, he felt that they were on solid ground. As he walked through the bustling terminal of the airline's flagship hub, he noticed something that gave him pause. A young flight attendant, wearing a badge with the airline's new slogan, "Every passenger matters," was helping an elderly woman with her luggage. The attendant's demeanor was kind and patient, her smile genuine. Daniel watched the interaction for a moment, then continued on his way, a faint smile on his lips. The tide was turning, and he knew they were just getting started. As the evening descended over the city, Daniel Carter returned to his penthouse, the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders. The summit had been a resounding success, and Karen's speech was already being hailed as a turning point for the airline. Yet for Daniel, the victory felt incomplete. He knew that systemic change was a marathon, not a sprint, and that every milestone was accompanied by new challenges. Settling into the leather armchair by the window, Daniel stared out at the city lights, his mind racing. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Olivia. "Good evening, Daniel," she said, her tone brisk but warm. "I thought you'd want to know. The response to Karen's speech has been overwhelming. Major industry outlets are covering it, and several airlines have reached out about collaboration." "That's good to hear," Daniel replied, though his voice carried a hint of weariness. "What about the internal feedback?" "Mostly positive," Olivia said, then hesitated. "But there are pockets of resistance, particularly among senior staff. Some feel the changes are too disruptive, too fast." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "Disruption is the point, Olivia. Complacency is what got us here in the first place." Olivia's silence spoke volumes, but Daniel could sense her agreement. "I'll schedule a meeting with the senior team to address their concerns," she said finally. "We'll keep the momentum going." "Thank you, Olivia," Daniel said. "And get some rest. You've earned it." After hanging up, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The airline's transformation was undeniably making waves, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were yet to come. Change was uncomfortable, and not everyone was ready to embrace it. Across town, Karen sat in her apartment, staring at her laptop screen. The video of her speech was playing on a loop, the comment section flooded with praise and support. Yet among the positivity, a few critical remarks stood out like thorns. "She's just trying to save her job," one comment read. "Too little, too late," said another. Karen's chest tightened as she scrolled through the negativity. No matter how far she had come, there were always reminders of her past mistakes. She closed the laptop with a sigh and leaned back on the couch, her thoughts drifting to the summit. The applause, the standing ovation, they had felt surreal. But the work that lay ahead loomed larger than ever. Karen knew that her role in the airline's transformation was far from over. If anything, the summit had only heightened expectations. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a text from Daniel. "Your speech was extraordinary. Take a moment to celebrate. You've earned it." Karen smiled faintly, the simple message lifting her spirits. She replied, "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without your support." The next morning, Daniel and Karen found themselves back in the thick of things. At a high-level strategy meeting with the airline's senior management team, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Margaret Hale, the CEO, was first to speak. "While I commend the progress we've made, we need to be cautious about how far we push this narrative. Not every market will respond favorably to these changes." Daniel's expression hardened. "And what narrative is that, Margaret?" "Treating people with respect, ensuring fairness and dignity." "I wasn't aware those were controversial values." Margaret's face flushed. "You know what I mean, Daniel. We've received feedback from certain regions expressing concerns about the inclusivity training. They feel it's unnecessary." Daniel's gaze swept across the room. "Feedback from whom?" "Employees unwilling to examine their biases, customers who don't want to adapt to a changing world. If we let fear dictate our decisions, we'll undo everything we've accomplished." The room fell silent, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. Karen, seated near the end of the table, felt a surge of admiration. Daniel's unwavering commitment to the mission was inspiring, even in the face of resistance. After a long pause, Greg Lawson, the younger board member who had supported Daniel from the start, spoke up. "I think Daniel's right. We're not just an airline. We're a global company. Our values should reflect that. If some people can't accept it, That's their problem, not ours. Margaret sighed, her shoulders sagging. Fine, but we'll need to manage the messaging carefully. We always do, Daniel said, his tone final. As the weeks passed, the airline's transformation continued to gain momentum. Karen took on a more prominent role, working closely with Monica Perez to refine the training programs and ensure they resonated with employees at all levels. She also began mentoring other staff members who struggled with the same biases she had once grappled with. One such mentee was Brad, the skeptical pilot she had confronted during the training session in Chicago. Over time, their conversations grew less confrontational and more constructive. Brad even admitted that the training had made him more aware of how he interacted with passengers and crew. "It's not easy," Brad confessed during one of their meetings, "but I can see why it matters." Karen smiled. "That's all anyone can ask, that you're willing to try." On a crisp autumn morning, Daniel and Karen stood side by side at a groundbreaking ceremony for a new community engagement center sponsored by the airline. The center would serve as a hub for workforce development programs, offering training and mentorship opportunities for underserved communities. As reporters snapped photos and local officials delivered speeches, Daniel leaned toward Karen. "This is what it's all about," he said quietly, "creating opportunities for people who've been overlooked." Karen nodded, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It's incredible to think how far we've come. And to think, it all started with a hat." Daniel chuckled softly. Funny how the smallest things can spark the biggest changes. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she stepped up to the podium, her confidence radiating. She spoke about the airline's journey, the lessons learned, and the importance of accountability. But most of all, she emphasized the power of collective effort. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, "and it doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when we come together, when we challenge each other, and when we refuse to settle for the way things have always been." As she looked out at the crowd, Karen felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, she felt truly prepared to walk it, alongside the people who believed in her and the mission they shared. And as Daniel watched her from the sidelines, he knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they had built something extraordinary. Now, it was up to the world to follow their lead. A legacy of change. The transformation Daniel Carter and Karen Bishop had spearheaded was no longer just a corporate initiative. It had grown into a movement. The airline, once mired in controversy and skepticism, was now a symbol of progress and accountability. But as with any journey of change, the work was never truly finished. A new chapter. It was a crisp winter morning when Daniel stood in front of a packed auditorium at the airline's annual employee summit. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of excitement and curiosity. Employees from every level of the company were present, along with partners, industry leaders, and media representatives. Karen sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. This summit marked the culmination of months of relentless work and the beginning of a new chapter. Daniel approached the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. The audience quieted as he began to speak. "When I first joined this airline, I didn't plan to make waves," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't plan to overhaul policies or spark debates. I planned to run a business. But sometimes, life throws you challenges that demand more than just business as usual." He glanced at Karen, who offered him an encouraging nod. That challenge came in the form of a single moment, a moment where biases were exposed, assumptions were made, and mistakes were confronted. But instead of letting that moment define us, we chose to let it transform us. Daniel gestured to a large screen behind him, which displayed images from the airline's journey, training sessions, community outreach programs, and smiling employees wearing the company's new slogan on their uniforms, "Every passenger matters." "We've redefined what it means to serve," Daniel continued. "We've shown that accountability isn't a weakness, it's a strength. And we've proven that change is possible, even in the face of resistance." The room erupted in applause, but Daniel raised a hand, signaling for quiet. None of this would have been possible without the people in this room. From the ground crews to the flight attendants to the senior leadership team, you all made this happen. And one person, in particular, deserves special recognition. He turned to Karen, his expression warm. "Karen Bishop, please join me." Karen's heart pounded as she rose to her feet. The applause grew louder as she made her way to the stage, her steps steady despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. When she reached the podium, Daniel stepped aside, allowing her to address the crowd. Karen's moment. Karen took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces before her. A year ago, she began, her voice clear and strong. "I made a mistake that changed the course of my life. At the time, I thought it was the worst thing that could have happened to me. But today, I see it for what it was, a wake-up call." She paused, her hands resting on the podium. "That wake-up call forced me to confront my biases, to take responsibility for my actions, and to commit to doing better. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I doubted whether I could rise to the challenge. But I had the support of people who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Her eyes met Daniel's, and he nodded encouragingly. "This journey has taught me that growth is possible for anyone willing to put in the work. It's taught me that change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we come together, when we listen to each other, and when we refuse to let fear hold us back." Karen stepped back, her voice rising with conviction. "Today, I'm proud to stand before you as proof that mistakes don't have to define us. What defines us is how we choose to move forward." The applause was deafening as Karen finished, and she felt a surge of pride and gratitude. As she stepped back to her seat, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "You've inspired more people than you know." Challenges ahead. Despite the airline's successes, not everyone was on board with the changes. In some regions, employees and customers alike expressed frustration with the new policies, viewing them as unnecessary or even intrusive. Competitors began exploiting the controversy, launching ad campaigns that subtly criticized the airline's initiatives. Daniel knew this was inevitable. Change doesn't happen without resistance, he told his leadership team during a strategy meeting. But every challenge is an opportunity to prove why this matters. Karen, now a key advisor on the airline's diversity and inclusion initiatives, proposed a bold idea. "Let's lean into the criticism," she said. "Let's show people the tangible impact these changes are having, not just for us, but for our customers and communities." Her suggestion led to a groundbreaking campaign called Stories That Soar. The campaign featured real stories from passengers and employees whose lives had been touched by the airline's transformation. A single mother shared how a flight attendant went out of her way to help her manage her crying baby. A pilot recounted how the training programs had helped him handle a tense situation with empathy. A former skeptic spoke about how the reforms had renewed their pride in the company. The campaign went viral, silencing many critics and earning praise from unexpected quarters. Even some competitors began quietly adopting similar programs, though few were willing to acknowledge the airline as their inspiration. Building bridges. As the movement grew, Karen and Daniel began working with other industries to share what they had learned. They spoke at conferences, collaborated with advocacy groups, and even advised government agencies on creating more inclusive policies. One particularly memorable event was a roundtable discussion hosted by the United Nations on fostering inclusivity in global industries. Karen sat alongside leaders from technology, healthcare, and education, sharing the airline's journey and the lessons learned along the way. "Every sector has its biases," she said during the discussion. "But those biases don't have to define us. With the right tools and the right mindset, we can build systems that lift people up instead of holding them back." The legacy. By the time the next year rolled around, the airline was virtually unrecognizable from the company it had once been. Employee satisfaction reached record highs, passenger loyalty soared, and the company's stock price reflected the public's renewed confidence. For Daniel, The greatest victory wasn't the financial success. It was the cultural shift. "This is about more than profits," he said during an interview with a major news outlet. "It's about leaving a legacy that proves business can be a force for good." Karen, too, found fulfillment in her new role. Though her journey had begun with a mistake, it had led her to a purpose she never could have imagined. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Karen and Daniel sat together in the airline's flagship lounge, reflecting on everything they had accomplished. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Karen asked, swirling her glass of wine. "Every day," Daniel replied. "And I know we're not done yet. There's always more to do." Karen nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "But it's worth it." Daniel raised his glass. "To the journey." "To the journey," Karen echoed. And as they clinked glasses, they both knew that the ripple effects of their work would continue to spread across the airline, across industries, and across the world. The ripple effect. Months after the success of the Stories That Soar campaign, the airline's transformation began to inspire organizations far beyond the aviation industry. Companies in tech, retail, healthcare, and education reached out to Daniel and Karen for guidance on fostering inclusivity and accountability. The reforms that had once been dismissed as radical were now being celebrated as visionary. Karen found herself busier than ever, traveling to speak at conferences, consulting with other companies, and mentoring employees within the airline. Despite her demanding schedule, she remained deeply connected to the work she had started. She often said, "This isn't just a job, it's a responsibility." One of the most poignant moments of the ripple effect came when a letter arrived at Daniel's office. It was handwritten, a rarity in the digital age. The sender was a former flight attendant from another airline who had faced discrimination due to their appearance. "I want to thank you and your team," the letter read. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself and my colleagues. Because of your example, my airline is finally taking steps to address these issues. I never thought I'd see this day." Daniel shared the letter with Karen during one of their strategy meetings. Her eyes glistened as she read it, the weight of the words settling over her like a warm embrace. "This," she said softly, "is why we do what we do." Expanding horizons. As the airline continued to thrive, Daniel and Karen began exploring ways to expand their impact. They established a nonprofit foundation, Elevate, dedicated to promoting inclusivity, empathy, and leadership in workplaces worldwide. The foundation offered grants to small businesses and startups that demonstrated a commitment to these values, as well as scholarships for students pursuing careers in human resources and organizational psychology. Karen was named the foundation's first executive director, a role she embraced with both humility and determination. Under her leadership, Elevate launched initiatives that brought inclusivity training to underserved communities, ensuring that the tools for growth and understanding weren't limited to corporate boardrooms. One of Elevate's earliest success stories was a program implemented at a small regional airline struggling with low employee morale and high turnover. Karen and her team worked closely with the airline's leadership, adapting the principles she and Daniel had pioneered. Within a year, the airline reported significant improvements in employee satisfaction and passenger feedback. During a press event celebrating the program's success, Karen spoke about the broader vision of Elevate. "Every organization has the potential to be a force for good," she said. "It starts with the willingness to listen, to learn, and to lead with integrity." A personal milestone. Amid her professional successes, Karen also experienced a personal milestone that brought her journey full circle. She received an invitation to speak at her alma mater, a small liberal arts college where she had once dreamed of making a difference, but had lost her way. Standing in the lecture hall where she had once been a student, Karen felt a mix of nerves and nostalgia. She addressed the audience of students and faculty with the same candor that had become her hallmark. "My story isn't one of perfection," she began. "It's a story of mistakes, growth, and second chances. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that our greatest failures can become our greatest teachers, if we're willing to face them." Her speech received a standing ovation, and afterward, She spent hours talking with students who shared their dreams and fears. One student, a young woman majoring in sociology, asked Karen what kept her motivated. "The people," Karen replied without hesitation. "Every person who's willing to take a step toward understanding. No matter how small, that's what keeps me going." The future beckons. Back at the airline, Daniel was preparing for another bold move. He had been quietly working on a project to create a network of community hubs at major airports, spaces designed to provide support and resources for travelers and employees alike. These hubs would offer everything from mental health services to cultural workshops, reinforcing the airline's commitment to inclusivity and care. Karen was instrumental in shaping the vision for these hubs, ensuring they reflected the values they had worked so hard to instill. "These spaces need to be more than just rooms," she said during a planning meeting. "They need to be safe havens, places where people feel seen and valued." The first hub was unveiled at the airline's flagship airport in Atlanta. The opening ceremony was attended by community leaders, employees, and passengers, all eager to see the culmination of months of effort. Karen and Daniel stood side by side as the ribbon was cut, their shared vision now a tangible reality. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said during his speech. "We're not just building spaces, we're building bridges. Bridges that connect people across differences and remind us of our shared humanity." A final reflection. On a quiet evening months later, Karen and Daniel found themselves once again at the airline's flagship lounge. The terminal was bustling, but their corner of the lounge felt like an oasis. Karen gazed out at the runway, her expression contemplative. "Do you ever wonder if we've done enough?" she asked. Daniel sipped his coffee, considering her question. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "But change isn't about reaching an endpoint. It's about creating momentum, ensuring that the work continues, even after we're gone."